we are going to be going through the new APA guidelines, recommendations, I wouldn't call them rules, for how to use inclusive language in your academic writing. So I do, as I said, I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to use to do this. So I'm going to share my screen, starting now. So everybody should be able to see this. I'm going to get it started here. All right. Okay, so here we are, APA bias-free language guidelines. How to make your writing inclusive. I also like to refer to this as language sensitivity, using language in a way that is sensitive to the issues out there that we have that are related to well, a variety of things, identity primarily, but we'll see how that works as we go. So, okay, the first thing I need to do, here we go, all right. Okay, so the necessity of using bias-free language. And I'm going to tell you right off the bat here as we get started, it says at the bottom here that this is quoted from the Concise Guide to APA Style 7th edition. And I may as well expand that citation. Pretty much everything that you're going to see on the screen here is taken directly out of the Concise Guide to APA Style 7th edition. Most of it from chapter 3, I think, 3 or 4. It'll say at the end. There's a chapter that is specifically about bias-free language, and I have just pretty much taken everything from there. So that, just so you know, that is always a good resource. Although for anyone who wants it, I will say right now, I can make the PowerPoint that I'm using also available to anyone. So if you want to use the PowerPoint, I can make sure that you get that. So in any case, let's start off here with why we need to use bias-free language. So quoting from the APA Style Guide, writers must strive to use language that is free of bias, meaning the implied or irrelevant evaluation of the group or groups they're writing about. As an organization, the APA is committed to both the advancement of science and the fair treatment of individuals and groups. These principles require that students and authors who use APA style avoid perpetuating demeaning attitudes in their writing. It is unacceptable to use constructions that might imply prejudicial beliefs or perpetuate biased assumptions against persons, and writers should use affirming and inclusive language. And this is all a result of our more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of things like gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, all of the things that we're going to cover in the course of this presentation, which I'm going to show you right now. Specific subject areas that require an awareness of language, that require you to use bias-free language, that it require you to cultivate a sensitivity towards the kind of language you use, are these: age, disability, gender, racial identity or ethnicity, sexuality or sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, marital status, immigration status, and religion. And again, these are all taken from the APA book. So these are the specific areas that the APA is specifically concerned with in the manual. So let's talk about some general guidelines. First, when we're talking about any of these things, we want to make sure that we are describing at the appropriate level of specificity. In other words, focus on relevant characteristics, acknowledge relevant differences that do exist. Relevant, obviously, being the important word here. If you don't need to be discussing these issues, then don't. If you do, and if you are, then you need to do so in ways that are specific. So it says to be appropriately specific. What does this mean? use exact ages or age ranges. They are more specific than broad categories. Names of conditions are more specific than categories of conditions or general references. Descriptors with modifiers are more specific than descriptors without modifiers. This will all make more sense as we continue, and you'll see examples of this. Nation or region of origin is more specific than a generalized origin. Names of people's orientations are more specific than broad group labels, and income ranges or specific designations are more specific than general labels. So in other words, as a rule, you want to try to be more specific rather than general, whenever possible. Second, be sensitive to labels. I think a lot of us don't particularly like the idea of labeling human beings, but it is something that human beings do. And so I think the idea here is that if we're going to do it, if we are going to use labels to refer to human beings, we should do so in a way that is sensitive and accurate. So first thing in terms of being sensitive to labels is to always acknowledge people's humanity, always provide operational definitions and labels, make sure that your readers know what you're talking about when you use particular terms, and always try to avoid false hierarchies. Using hierarchies, discussing these issues in terms of hierarchies is usually not particularly accurate. I mean, unless that's the specific point of what you're writing about, we want to avoid value judgments, classifications. So let's start with age, reducing bias by topic age, terms for different age groups. And so a lot of what the APA manual does is what you're looking at here. Specific guidelines and recommendations for what kind of language to use when you're talking about age, what kind of language to use and what kind of language to avoid. So it starts with an individual of any age, person or individual. Avoid using males and females as nouns. Instead, use men and women or other age-appropriate words. Males and females are appropriate when the groups referred to include a broad range of ages. So getting specific here, 12 years old or younger, there's a variety of words you can use. APA recommends things like infant, child, girl, boy, transgender girl, gender fluid child, etc. Again, the idea is to use words that are age appropriate. So from 13 to 17, you have words like adolescent, young person, youth, young woman, young man, female adolescent, male adolescent, etc. Male and female being used here in conjunction with other words, adolescent in this case, which kind of gets around the way they're discouraging you to use males and females individually like that. It's okay here because you're not using them individually, you're using them in association with things like adolescent. 18 and older, adult, woman, man, trans woman, transgender adults, you get the idea. Now, it's when you get into older adults where this becomes an issue of sensitivity. And so you have words like older people, older adults, older patients, people 65 and older, and so on. But you'll notice that this is where you get into the kinds of words that you should avoid. So terms to avoid when writing of older adults, things like senior, elderly, aged or aged, senile, which is an outdated term, and even today you would only be using that with reference to people with dementia. And in fact, dementia itself is preferred. And in fact, if you can, you should be as specific as possible about the type of dementia that you're dealing with. And then there's another statement here about generational descriptions, which we're all used to, Gen X, Millennial, Boomer, Gen Z. You really should only use those if you are specifically discussing generational designations and generational distinctions. Otherwise, I would say try to, excuse me, try to avoid them. that's really all I have to say about age. And they move right on then to reducing bias by topic and discussing disability. And this is where you see them recommending or making a distinction between person first language and identity first language. And I think those designations tell you exactly what they mean. So person first language emphasizes the person rather than the disabling or the chronic condition. So you would say a person with paraplegia or a youth with epilepsy rather than paraplegic or epileptic, right? Because the first one, a person with paraplegia, clearly emphasizes the person rather than paraplegic, which emphasizes the condition. It is possible and sometimes even desirable to emphasize the disability, particularly, as your definition here says, when the focus is on the disability as an expression of cultural pride, as in blind, autistic, amputee, deaf is a word that has been reclaimed by that community. So there are times when identity first language is appropriate and I think expected. You should probably do what you can to find out. Again, I like deaf, I know is a term that that community has taken on to apply to itself. So there are times when that is appropriate. Although I think most of the time you're going to default to person first language. But the next note, choosing between person first and identity first language, indicates if the person or group's preferred designation is known, then you can use it. So again, if you know that your group of sight disabled people prefers to be called blind, then you know that you can refer to them that way. So it's a question of knowing the designation. If you don't, you can use either form interchangeably until the group preference or the personal preference is known. As with any of these subject areas, though, you want to establish the relevance of mentioning, in this case, disabilities. But it doesn't matter whether you're talking disability, whether you're talking sexuality, gender identity, religion, whatever it is, make sure that you establish in the writing why it's necessary for you to discuss these topics at all, right? Presumably you wouldn't be bringing it up if it wasn't something that's relevant to your discussion. So it's something you would want to be making clear to your readers in any case, but I think it's doubly important when you're discussing these kinds of subjects that you establish the relevance. Obviously, as with any other of these kinds of topics, there is negative and condescending language and terminology that exists. We want to avoid using it. And these guidelines do change, right? Because these recommendations change, preferences change over time. And so it is something that you have to kind of try to keep up with. But these are the current recommendations. So for example, avoid anything that implies restriction. So we prefer not to say things like wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. And so the current usage recommends wheelchair user rather than confined to a wheelchair. We also want to avoid language that uses negative labels or things that can be read as slurs, things like victim, damaged, cripple, obviously. Handicapped, I mean, obviously there are places where that is still used. I think in your academic writing, there are probably better words you can find. Things like, I mean, okay, these are pretty obvious, I think. Invalid, nuts, crazy. Obviously the R word, retarded, we don't use that word anymore. There was a time, some of you may know this, some of you may remember it. There was a time when the word was actually fairly common. It is obviously not anymore. So again, this is all a matter of increasing your sensitivity. Terms like alcoholic, I mean, alcoholic, I think is I could be wrong about this, but I think it's a clinical term. So I think you probably should only use it in a clinical context. But as a general guideline, it's the language that you're looking to avoid is anything that comes across as negative or can be read as insulting or as a slur. And The flip side of that is that don't be condescending. You want to avoid any condescending euphemisms, things like special needs, physically challenged, handy capable. There was a time when, again, handy capable was fairly well accepted. I don't see it used a lot anymore because it does seem condescending. Specifically in a healthcare setting, so any of you who are in healthcare, if you're in nursing or physical therapy or sports medicine or anything like that, you want to refer to people with disabilities specifically as patients or clients, right? Okay, so let's move on to gender. This becomes a little bit more complicated. And the reason for this is because in the past 20 years, 30 years maybe, we have developed much more complex, much more nuanced, much more sophisticated understandings of gender. So for example, gender and sex are not the same thing. You probably notice that there are still people out there who talk about them as if they are, which is of course why it's problematic, right? We were talking about something in one of my classes the other day. The author of the reading we were talking about actually made a point at one point of referring to both genders. And we had to stop and discuss the fact that we recognize that gender is not a binary thing. So to speak of both genders is technically inaccurate, right? So the language that we recommend that you use now, and you think about when you're writing about gender and gender identity, is it reflects our more complex understanding of what gender is and how gender works now. So to continue here, there are a number of definitions here. Gender is a social construct and identity, and it refers to attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that a culture associates with a person's biological sex. Obviously, sometimes those two things don't go together. While there are two biological human sexes, there are a multitude of genders, and they do not always match the biological sex or sex assigned at birth. So gender identity is a person's psychological sense of their gender, and all humans have one. We all have gender identity. It's also distinct from sexual orientation, and there are people who do sometimes conflate the two. We shouldn't, because they're not the same. When reporting gender, APA says this: authors are strongly encouraged to explicitly designate information about the gender identities of participants making up their samples rather than assuming cisgender identities. And I don't know if this is a term that you've come across before. It's a fairly common one these days, cisgender, referring to when the birth assignment, sex, and gender identity align, when they're the same. So a person who is born with a female sex and has a gender identity of female, that's cisgender, opposed to transgender, where those two things are not necessarily aligned. Excuse me, sorry, one more time. Let me take a drink here, sorry. So, a couple more terms. Cisgenderism or cissexism refer to the belief that cisgendering, the alignment of birth assignment, sex, and gender identity, is normative. Genderism is the belief that there are only two genders and that gender must conform to sex assigned at birth. Obviously, we know that neither of those things are true. There are more than two genders, and clearly gender and sex assignment or birth assignment sex do not always conform. We also know that cisgendering is not normative. It's just common, to quote Dorothy Parker. Let's continue. So, in contrast to cisgendering, transgender is when gender identity does not conform with the sex assigned at birth. Some transgender people express a binary gender, like man or woman, Some are non-binary. This is an increasingly prevalent designation that you'll see when we use the abbreviation LGBTQ, which is kind of it's the blanket designation that we use: LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning. Sometimes you'll see added to that A, I, P, excuse me, I'm really sorry, a number of other things representing things like pansexual, non-binary, asexual. Guys, I'm really sorry. I don't know what's going on with my throat all of a sudden. Let me take another drink. I apologize. This is what you get when you talk for a living. Some people are non-binary. They use different terms, may use different terms to refer to themselves. So we have terms like non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, gender non-conforming, agender, gender creative, or if you are Indigenous or Native American, two-spirit. There are a variety of terms. This is a few of them. There are others as well. So to continue with our definitions, terms like trans prejudice and trans negativity, these are obviously terms that denote discriminatory attitudes towards transgender individuals. Excuse me. There is the abbreviation TGNC, which stands for transgender and gender nonconforming, which can be used as a blanket designation to cover all transgender, non-binary individuals. Now, we do use sex assignment, either assigned sex or sex assigned at birth, when discussing physical or biological sex. In fact, we don't really use those expressions, physical or biological sex, anymore. These terms, assigned sex or sex assigned at birth, are preferred. And I want to emphasize, I say that these terms are preferred. There aren't any laws or anything that say you can't use particular words. This is about increasing our sensitivity. It's about expressing our sensitivity in the language that we choose. So this is obviously preferred terminology. In some cases, the terminology that is no longer preferred is not necessarily offensive. It's just not really used anymore. So it's really about just kind of keeping up with the way the language is evolving to keep up with our increasingly sophisticated understanding of these issues. Obviously, some things are considered, derogatory slurs, completely offensive. Obviously, you really don't want to use those. But again, I just want to emphasize that this is about increasing our sensitivity, using our language to show that sensitivity. And so this is kind of where the language is right now with respect to these issues. So the last section you see there, disparaging terms, include things like birth sex, natal sex, transsexual. That used to be actually a fairly common term. Those of you who are familiar with the Rocky Horror Picture Show, remember there's a song in there that uses the term. It, as I said, was common. It's not anymore. And obviously tranny is considered fairly offensive. So we avoid that one as well. Terms like transvestite, which refers to cross-dressing, and drag, is considered outdated. And in fact, we prefer drag or cross-dressing. So noun usage. And this is where language can get tricky. So a few guidelines here. Refer to all people, including transgender people, by the name they use to refer to themselves. So if the person refers to themselves as transgender, that's what you call them. If they refer to themselves as non-binary, that's what you call them, right? So to the extent that it's possible, we want to make sure that we know how people refer to themselves. You want to use specific nouns to identify people or groups of people. So obviously things like women, men, transgender men, trans women, cisgender men, and so on. I've discussed this before, but we use male and female as adjectives when appropriate and relevant. And so here, the recommendation is you use male and female as nouns when the age range of the referred group is broad or it's ambiguous. Otherwise, you should try to avoid using those terms as noun and only use them as modifiers. When you're referring to all human beings, we use things like individuals, people, persons, humans, humanity, rather than the outdated and fairly patriarchal terms, man, mankind, right? So the other ones are preferred. You've probably noticed this, you will still run into people who refer to man and mankind. It's actually still fairly common. I think it reflects a fairly outmoded way of thinking about human beings as a group. And this is an interesting thing. We're at the point where this used to be fairly common in English, and I think it's becoming less common. Gendered endings such as man or ESS when referring to occupations. So the common example is things like police officer rather than policeman, actor or aviator. And by the way, actress, that's still a really common term, right? I mean, all the awards that are out there, they still refer to, best actress, best supporting actress. But it's actually better policy, I think, to just refer to all actors as actors. And certainly we don't refer to female pilots as aviatrixes, which is at this point, I would say, fairly antique term. And obvious things like flight attendant rather than stewardess, okay, things like that. So a good example is nurse, right? We use the term nurse regardless of whether the nurse is male or female or transgender or whatever gender identity they identify. Okay, pronouns. This is where gender becomes obviously a major issue. Pronouns have become an area of language that requires really fine sensitivity here. So the first thing that you need to understand is when you're referring to pronouns of transgender or gender non-confirming or non-binary people, try to get out of the habit of referring to them as preferred pronouns. I think the obvious reason there is that this implies that gender identity is a choice, which of course it isn't. So we recommend that you use identified pronouns or simply pronouns. The best thing you can do is when you are writing about known or identified individuals, learn their pronouns and use them, right? So if you do know the pronouns of the people you are referring to, that's what you should use. I love this conversation because this discussion about they has changed so much in the last 10 years. If you had sat in one of my classes 10 years ago and we talked about using the singular they, I and pretty much everybody else who was teaching these kinds of classes would have said, well, it's okay, you can use it, but it's not great and you should find other solutions. We don't teach that anymore. The use of the singular they has become almost universally accepted by all language authorities, certainly that I'm familiar with, including the APA. And again, this is coming from the APA. And so let's talk about this. When referring to individuals whose gender identity and pronouns are unknown, or when gender is not relevant to your discussion, or you are referring to people using generalities or hypotheticals, right, where you're referring to large groups of people, the APA now endorses the use of the singular they, right? And you know the problem here, right, or the so-called problem. They is a plural pronoun. We've been using it, and by the way, we've been using it for centuries, okay? We've been using the singular they since Chaucer, Shakespeare. They both used it. Jane Austen used it. It's been around for a long time. And it's very common. We all do it, certainly when we talk. So it's not a new thing, but sometime in the 19th century, I don't know, some language gurus decided that it was bad and we shouldn't do it anymore. And that became kind of the rule, and it's stuck. And so for 150 years, there's been this rule that says you can't use a plural pronoun to refer to a singular noun. Obviously you can, because we've been doing it for hundreds of years. And really all that's happening here is, I think that language experts, people who teach language, people who teach writing, are recognizing that we've been doing it for a long time and there's nothing wrong with it. And when we start talking about gender and gender identity, it's actually a very helpful word to have. The reason being that English does not have gender neutral pronouns. So rather than create new ones, and there have been efforts to create new pronouns that are gender neutral, but they haven't really caught on very much. We have this word that we've been using, as I said, for centuries, to do the job of a gender neutral pronoun. And so the usage of this pronoun they to refer to singular nouns has become, as I said, widely accepted, almost universally accepted. So, as I said, the APA now endorses the use of the singular they. Specifically, we're talking about they, them, theirs, and themselves, which are the standard common plural pronouns. I've seen some people use themself, which is an effort to turn one specific plural pronoun into a singular. I don't particularly like it. I don't think it works very well. I think themselves is just fine. But you will see that there are some people who use that. This is a direct quote. Although usage of the singular they was once discouraged in academic writing, many advocacy groups and publishers have accepted and endorsed it. The use of the singular they is inclusive of all people, helps writers avoid making assumptions about gender, and is part of APA style. So if you're ever questioned about this, you can absolutely refer to the APA manual. They are very clear about this, that it is a completely legitimate usage of the plural pronoun. And in fact, there was a time when you probably would have been told, if you look at the last bullet point here, to, instead of using the singular they, to use he or she or he, she, he. We actually tell you it's better to use they now than to refer to he or she or he, partly because he or she or he implies binary gender, which of course, as we've seen, is gender is not binary. Also because it's kind of clunky. So again, we recommend that you use they instead of things like he or she, etc. In addition, because we want to avoid implying that gender is binary, we avoid terms like opposite sex, opposite gender. You can refer to another sex, another gender. It's more correct. And let's, we should be clear about this, that, certainly in APA style, accuracy is one of the goals of using language and writing using APA style. And so another sex or another gender is more accurate than opposite sex or opposite gender. You can also use things like mixed sex or mixed gender, same sex or same gender to refer to couples, partners, or members of relationships. Okay, let's move on. Racial and ethnic identity. The first recommendation here, choose your terms carefully. APA guide says terms used to refer to racial and ethnic groups continue to change over time. One reason for this is simply personal preference. Preferred designations can become dated over time and may hold negative connotations. When describing racial and ethnic groups, be appropriately specific and sensitive to issues of label. So there you see the issue of specificity again. Be as specific as you possibly can. Racial and ethnic groups are designated by proper nouns and are capitalized. So black, white, you will refer to them that way, and you will use, or you should use, capital letters. There aren't any other colors that we use to refer to groups of humans. So it's just black or white. In terms of capitalization, when we look at terms like Native American, Hispanic, anything like that, you're going to capitalize them. You will capitalize terms like indigenous or aboriginal. Don't use hyphens. You may have seen people do that. You may have felt the urge to insert a hyphen in African American or Native American. Don't do it. Just the two words. When you use terms like multiracial, biracial, multi-ethnic, those are lowercase. Now, the APA guide has a lot to say, as you can see here, about specific groups and how to refer to them. So I don't know that I have to read through all of this specifically, but you'll get an idea of kind of what we're talking about. So it begins with people who have come from African origin. They have widely varied cultural backgrounds, family histories, family experiences, and also they come from different places. The Caribbean islands, Latin America, various parts of the United States, countries in Africa, and elsewhere all over the world. So there are a variety of different terms, different words that we use to discuss these particular groups of people. Some people prefer African American, some prefer Black. Both are acceptable, but they shouldn't be used interchangeably. So the obvious reason is that not all Black people are American. In some things that you'll read, things that were written in the 60s or even before, you will sometimes come across the terms Negro or African American. These are considered outdated and are not in current use anymore, but you will come across, you will see them if you're reading older texts. So then you can see there's a lot of recommendations, similar recommendations for people of Asian origin. A lot of different ways depending on the specifics, and there's that idea again of what you're dealing with here. Things like Oriental used to be common. It's an older designation, and it is now primarily used to refer to things like rugs. We don't use it when referred to people. It's considered pejorative. So again, here the recommendation is be as specific as you can. Refer to specific nation or region of origin whenever possible. By the way, that same rule or that same guideline holds true when speaking of indigenous people around the world. In North America, we use terms like Native American, Native North American, which are probably preferable to American Indian, although you will find that there are those who do continue to use American Indian, and it's not necessarily considered bad. I think things like Native American are considered preferable, but I do know some people that we would commonly refer to as Native American who prefer not to be referred to as Native American. They actually prefer to be referred to as American Indian, and so in a lot of cases it's a personal preference. The rule of thumb here, it's best, if at all possible, to refer to the specific nation. So instead of Native American, Cherokee, Navajo, Lakota, etc. Try to refer to them as nations or peoples. Even cultures is acceptable, rather than tribes. Tribes is falling out of currency. So you can see different examples going down: Hawaiian natives, Canadian natives, Alaskan natives, Latin American or Caribbean, Australian, and New Zealand. There's a whole variety of terms: indigenous peoples, aboriginal peoples, specific nations like Inuit. Speaking of Inuit, Eskimo is considered derogatory, so you won't really see that being used as much anymore. So, again, the rule here, or the rule of thumb, if you want to think of it as a rule, the guideline, the recommendation is, whenever possible, refer to specific nations. If that's not possible, if you don't know those things, then you have more generalized references like Native, Native American, Indigenous, Aboriginal, and so on. There's more. We have Middle Eastern origin, Hispanic or Latin American origin. And here, the interesting issue here, if you can, consult with individual participants whenever you can to determine the appropriate choice. Because a lot of these are about personal preference, things like Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Chicano, and so on. The term Hispanic, as I understand it, refers to Spanish language speakers. This is something that's been discussed a lot. Latino is obviously gendered, masculine, and so some people consider it problematic. But some people also consider Latinx and Latinat problematic as well. For a variety of reasons, one of which is that some see them as an English appropriation of Spanish words. This can be a tricky area, so it's one of those areas where I recommend, as always, being as specific as you can, and whenever you know the preference of the people you're speaking of, you should go with that. In general, here it is again, you should be as specific as you can. Don't mix designations. So for example, don't refer to African Americans and whites because one group is being described by, color. Correct expression would be one or the other. So African Americans and white Americans, or blacks and whites, so on. Also, try to avoid essentialism, which is language that essentializes race or causes us to speak about race and ethnicity in sort of monolithic ways. So avoid things like the white race, the black race. They are essentialists. They portray human groups monolithically. There are other terms that you should be familiar with. I'm sure you've heard these: people of color, obviously underrepresented groups, rather than minorities. Minorities, again, was common at one time. I think it's still sort of a common term in sort of political discourse, but I think more sensitive terms would be things like people of color and underrepresented groups. Okay, sexual orientation or sexuality. And this is a big one. People are getting, and you've probably heard about situations where people have been called on referring to sexual orientation as sexual preference. The obvious reason not to do that is that sexuality isn't a choice, and therefore it's not a preference, and any implication that it is can be offensive, and we are not seeking to offend our readers. So be sensitive to that. Most common terms are the most appropriate: lesbian, gay, straight, bisexual, asexual, queer, polyamorous, pansexual, omnisexual. Queer is an interesting word because it's being reclaimed. It was a slur, a derogatory term. I think there are some people who still hear it that way, but it has been, for the most part, very successfully reclaimed by the LGBTQ community. So queer is acceptable. I've talked about this a little bit. The abbreviations can get out of control. I think the standard term now that's considered comprehensive and most appropriate is LGBTQ+. You may choose to expand that abbreviation if you feel like you need to specifically include other groups, the A for asexual, or the P for pansexual, or any number of other abbreviations that might be added there. Terms to avoid, right? The obvious slurs or pejoratives, things like homosexual, homosexuality, these are not necessarily pejorative, but they are not commonly used anymore. Pejorative, we all know what they are, right? I don't need to say them. So it's best to use specific identity first designations. So the ones that are listed above, things like gay, queer, bisexual, asexual, etc. Unless otherwise noted, I'm just going to read this. All material in this presentation was reproduced directly from Chapter 3 of the Concise Guide to the APA Style, Official APA Style Guide for Students, 7th edition, American Psychological Association, 2020, pages 55 to 80. So that, I mean, this material is out there for you to consult anytime you need to. That is everything I have for you today. So let me say a couple of things. First of all, thank you for coming. If anybody, if anybody had questions as I was going through the presentation, hopefully you were able to address them through the chat to Augie, and he was able to address your questions. So I will say, if anybody still has questions that they would like to ask or to address, please hang out for a couple minutes and you can ask them, and we will do our best to address them. Otherwise, I will say again, thank you. I can get out of this. Thank you again. But I think we are finished. So if anybody has any questions that they want to ask now, please go ahead.